Welcome to the Caribbean Property Investing Podcast, where we share real-life experiences for successful Caribbean property entrepreneurs. Learn about their successes, challenges, and strategies to help you create your plan for financial freedom. Now let's get started.
Welcome to a special edition of the Caribbean Property Investing Podcast. Today we have a special guest, and just in time to announce some special news. We are pleased, overwhelmed, and very grateful to announce our partnership with Bank of St. Lucia, St. Lucia's premier financial institution. We now will have a chat with the managing director of Bank of St. Lucia, better known as BOSL, Mr. Rolf Phillips. Mr. Phillips, welcome.
Thank you very much, Anselm, and it's really a pleasure being here to represent Bank of St. Lucia. Educating the public is a big part of what Bank of St. Lucia is about. It's a big part of our corporate outreach. That we are keen to see that the community in St. Lucia who we serve grow in financial literacy. It's a big part of what Bank of St. Lucia stands for, and we're certainly keen to partner with you in that regard.
For me, it was a no-brainer. I've been a customer of Bank of St. Lucia for more than 25 years. From my student loan way in the early 90s, grad school mortgages, my first mortgage, my home, and my other property investing endeavors. So for me, I felt that it was a good partnership, it's complementary. I'm the beneficiary of a number of the bank's financial services, but more importantly, I find tremendous satisfaction and competence in the relationship that I have with Bank of St. Lucia staff. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm Rolf Phillips, and I've been with the Bank of St. Lucia from the beginning of November last year, so still quite new in the role. I spent most of my career working with Barclays Bank, where I think almost all that I know about banking I learned at Barclays. Barclays had a really great background in developing and training staff, and are responsible for, I think, some of the strongest banking professionals around the region. Some of that tradition has continued with CIBC, who I worked with for quite a period after the merger. Several of my roles in CIBC and Barclays have actually been in support of property type of investment. I spent a good part of my early career on the international banking side, catering primarily not just to offshore banking clients, but we had a fairly big lending portfolio for non-residents purchasing investment properties throughout the region, second home property. So I ran that portfolio for quite a while, which was very, very interesting. A little bit different from what you would do on the domestic side, in that you have fairly high levels of contribution upfront by people seeking to buy a second home, and shorter periods to repay, because it's kind of treated like investment property. But that was a very interesting portfolio to run, and I ran that across most of the islands, primarily where we had offshore banking business. We ran that portfolio. But then I spent a large part of my career, I managed the mortgage portfolio for the entire Caribbean. So all retail and investment type mortgages, I ran that for quite a while. And then I ran retail banking, which is all the branches for the Caribbean. So I have quite a broad experience to property, not just in St. Lucia, who was part of my market on many of those different roles, but also to other parts of the Caribbean, where I can bring experiences from to the St. Lucia market.
So in other words, you are our guy and might become a staple on our show then.
Certainly happy to support whenever you would have me.
So you originally from the Spice Isle, Grenada. What were your first impressions coming to St. Lucia and looking at our market?
Well, I've been coming to St. Lucia for quite some time prior to now. Actually, as I said, when I spoke after, I think in my first couple of weeks, I went to visit the branch in Vieux-Fort, and I spoke to the staff of the Vieux-Fort branch and was telling them that I actually did my first after I came off the bank's management development program. which is about 30, 35 or so years ago. My first managerial job was as manager of the Vieux branch, Vieux and Soufrière branch as a cluster, which I did for a short period, was for a year. But I actually, cut my teeth as a manager of my first unit in Vieux. So, when I told them that Vieux was near and dear to my heart, I don't think they quite expected that it would be that close an experience. That I had with the team in Vieux. It was Barclays at the time, but nevertheless, it was a community of Vieux, which I have great affinity for. So that was my first managerial job, and then as part of my roles running the mortgage portfolio, I had salespeople all around the region, selling residential mortgages, and Andy Delmar, who went on to become, who is passed away, may his soul rest in peace, was my head of mortgages in St. Lucia, and his team, some of whom are still at the bank here, were very close to me. So I came here a few times a year and went around St. Lucia, looking at what they were doing, looking at opportunities in property. And then, of course, in my role as head of retail for First Caribbean, the St. Lucia branches reported to me. So I came quite frequently then, getting around and visiting St. Lucia. So I have a strong affinity to St. Lucia. I think outside of Grenada, it's one of the warmest places that I've felt from the time I came here, initially for work and then back to the many jazz festivals over the years. St. Lucia is just a very comfortable place. So moving here, since doing my first managerial job here, moving back here almost seems like something that I was meant to do.
Since this is a regional podcast, I can't speak of my island affinity outside of my home island. We'll keep that private. A while ago, you spoke about being responsible for the second home portfolio. For us, property investors, that is like next level. So I want us to start from the ground up, literally. Let's talk about how the bank can facilitate persons interested in getting on that property ladder. And for me, as we would have covered in some of the earlier podcasts, the first step is acquiring land. So there are pretty much three options that you have: acquiring land, acquiring a fixer-upper, or acquiring land and building a home. So let's just talk about acquiring land first. Tell us, what some of our listeners need to know in preparing for that first step in the property ladder.
Yeah, I mean, and you're quite right in that in most of the Caribbean islands, including St. Lucia, the initial route to owning a piece of property is to acquire a piece of land. St. Lucia, for most of the Caribbean, unlike the developed countries of the world where you never really acquire land, you buy a home in a development that's already been demarcated and owned by a developer. Our market is very much buy a piece of land or buy house and land, but buy a piece of land is always the best route. And we at Bank of St. Lucia have very good programs of people buying land, very small down payments in the front, up front. In some cases, you're willing to go as high as 100% financing, depending on the nature of the application. But fairly good long terms to repay. So you're looking at 15 years to repay a land loan, which ends up to be a pretty affordable installment. And the one thing I would advise borrowers to do is to start as early as possible. I mean, pretty soon after you've gotten past your first year or so in a job, and there is some sense of stability, or as soon as there is some stability, there's an opportunity to invest in a fixed asset. And a fixed asset, by that I mean, I'm not talking about a vehicle. I'm talking about a piece of land. Because even if you don't end up building or utilizing that piece of land, what you have continuing to happen every year as you own is equity building up into that piece of land that gives you the opportunity to then use that equity to either make it your contribution into buying a house, or certainly into using the equity for an investment into an investment property or something else. So I would encourage as soon as you start working and you get into settled employment, to acquire a piece of land, and the opportunities are there. So, my thing is that I think people think it's hard, and they allow that to delay making that investment. But I think it's important to come in, sit down, talk to your banker at Bank of St. Lucia, preferably, of course, at a pretty early stage, about what's available out there, what you can afford, which areas you're interested in, what are the costs that you would have to bear. And most borrowers will find that it's not as prohibitive as they can to acquire a piece of land and to start building up equity at a very early stage. If you have some equity, or if you're very fortunate where your parents or some family member gifted you a piece of property that you have equity in, well, then certainly you're well ahead of the game because you have an asset that you can start to trade with, and you can either do that from a personal standpoint, or you can look at doing so from as an investor standpoint.
Awesome. That's stage one. And I think in a previous
Mhm.
podcast, I think the first one, we would have established that you shouldn't go down the route that I went before getting a lot more financially literate, where I got another piece of land, maybe 4, 5 plots of land, paying mortgages on them, and just
Yeah.
waiting. If I were to lose my job, then certainly there's no cash coming in. I probably would have had to give up those properties. But fortunately, I was able. I met a mentor, and he advised me, and I started acting on developing those small lots one at a time. So let's go to stage two. You have already acquired the land, and now you have an idea of the house you want. What's the next step for that customer?
Well, I mean, just to pick back up on your previous point, I think staying in control of having a reasonable debt servicing capacity is very important. So stretching yourself out to be right on the edge, where should something happen you can't afford, is a little bit risky unless you have some other third party income to support you. So I would encourage you to stay with a relatively especially at early stages in your career, to stay within a reasonably comfortable debt servicing. But then you may be in a position like you, where you own one piece of land and you have some equity in that, which still gives you some flexibility. So you decide to invest in another piece, and there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you have. As I said, I would encourage you to sit down, have conversations with your bankers, really look at what you can afford. Banks are keenly interested in advising borrowers. So this idea that you feel like if you tell them everything, then they will know too much about you. But quite frankly, we consider ourselves to be a community bank. Bank of St. Lucia, we're very keen in our support of customers, and a lot of what we do is to provide guidance to people on how they could qualify for lending and borrowing, and the kind of things that could cause them trouble down the road. But we are certainly keen to lend as much money as we can, and certainly lending for purposes like land and property development is something that we have the largest portfolio on the island, and we're keen to expand. But when you're thinking about the next stage, and you may have built up some equity in that land, and you start to think, or you may have started to see some expansion in your earnings. So both can happen, because initially you may be borrowing maybe 30 or 35% of your income and loan payments, but you got a bit of promotions, your salary goes up, or you've paid the loan down for a little bit of time, and you start to think about investing in a property. And there could be one or two options. You can either maybe decide that the land that you own is what you're going to build on, or alternatively you may want to look at another area altogether. And both options could work, in that where you have equity in one piece of land, you could still use that equity to acquire another piece of land and build on it, or ultimately to acquire a house and land together. But the key thing here is to be aware of all that this involves, because this is, it's a lot of enthusiasm around buyers when they think about buying a property or getting to the next stage. So it's very easy to make some missteps around what you can actually afford and what the cost it will come along with. Like in a lot of cases, borrowers do not think enough about the legal costs which you have to go through to put title documents and mortgage documents in place. That could take you between 2.5% and 3.5% of the value of the house in itself. And then you have some closing costs with the bank. You'd have cost for your plans and for managing the project, which you will need to report on to the bank on an ongoing basis. So it's really, so before you start to sit down with and a lot of people, they do it back to front. They sit down first with an architect and he designs what they want. And then after the design is done, then you go to the bank and you try to shop it around because this is what you want. Whereas, if you come in at an early stage and said, look, this is what I'm thinking, you can get some ballpark numbers around cost per square foot. It's fairly standard in each market. So you talk to even a bank could advise you on what the average cost per square foot is. So you get a sense as to what square foot house you can afford. and then you will sit down and look at all of the costs that you need to get there, and then the ongoing maintenance cost. Because likewise, if you're building once you get into a house, you're talking about annual insurance premiums. You're looking at a little bit of money that you have to start setting aside for maintenance, which will come. So your bank is in great position to sit down and have that conversation with you, and then you go away and you engage your professionals to say, okay, my house is going to be 21. I'm doing a starter home. It's going to be 2,100 square feet, or I have a partner and our incomes have just gone up, so we have a good amount of disposable income, which will cover this amount of cost, and you can sit down then in a much more informed position, have something that's drawn up from planning that you don't have to go back and make amendments to, because you've already satisfied that cost is going to be within what you can borrow, and then you start moving forward from there and continuing to engage your bank as you go on. Once you get past that phase, it's about finding a contractor that that you could be very comfortable with, to get your estimates. We always encourage, unless you have somebody who you're very aware of from your family that you work with, and the work has been consistent and they can deliver on time. There's a lot of construction risk that borrowers in our market have to deal with, that you wouldn't normally get when you're buying into a development. Like if you're buying into a development where the contractor takes the risk, and you just pay a fixed price, is very different from where you manage the contract yourself. And a lot of the discipline that banks like Bank of St. Lucia try to bring to this process is to help borrowers to avoid cost overrun risk, which could be quite significant. I mean, on a house of, say, 300 to 500,000, if you overrun by 10%, you're talking about $50,000 in cost overruns, which most borrowers will find extremely difficult to fund, and can end up in a situation where the house is not properly finished. You can't get full value out of it. So all those things the bank will advise you about. I mean, and if we are aware, for example, we'll ask you questions that should cause you to ask questions of your contractors. Who have they worked for in the past? Are you familiar with them? Can you find out from any of these people as to whether this person delivers on time? Is my contract fixed price? Am I sure that all that's in here is what I need? And that's why we would insist on having a quantity surveyor provide a report on the estimate to see, because if contractors are bidding to do your house, some contractors their quotes may seem to be substantially lower than others, and that may be so, it may be a good deal, but a lot of cases it may be that the estimate just does not take into account all of the issues that the other contractors were seeing. So that's why we would get a QS estimate, and it's a little bit more a cost up front, but it's money well spent to enable a professional to use science to determine whether the quantities that are in that contract are suitable for the overall cost that we're getting at.
I try to again, listen, and with my turn. I didn't want to interrupt, because you said something that is so important and critical. Most of us do things back to front, right way around. We do a design of a house, and then we try to reverse engineer the budget for it. So my friends, anyone who would have spoken to me about it from experience, you tell them, okay, find out from the bank, and I realize that you're very, very strong on consultation with your banker, and I guess that's what personal banking and community banking gives, and that's the benefit of that relationship. Start with your approved budget in mind. Get that agreed first with your banker, and during that conversation, that banker will also tell you about exactly what you said: other closing costs, legal fees, and other administrative fees associated with the transaction. For St. Lucia, and anyone who wants to invest in St. Lucia or build in St. Lucia, I would say about $100 US or $270 per square foot is a good guide of the cost of building. $270, about 100 US. You might be lower, it might be a little higher, but $270 per square foot is decent. I know people who probably can build for $220, $200, but $270 is a good price. And you have to get that approved budget first, and then work back based on the square footage to know what size your house,
correctly.
your
Yes.
what size your house is going to
Yeah,
be, what size house you can build.
yeah. And one of the critical things there is that generally that 270 100 US 270 per square foot is standard pricing. And what people don't realize is the standard pricing also includes standard materials, standard fittings, um, all of that. But as you change those elements, the price goes up. And you could go up, it's amazing. Simple changes to plumbing fixtures and bathroom fixtures and lighting fixtures could have a significant impact on cost. And one of the challenges that we see is that sometimes even after we get through this process quite safely, and all of those things have been agreed, the homeowner goes to on the site and they see something laid out, because when it's laid out it looks different from what you see, and they say, oh, this room feels a little too tight, or the kitchen feels a little too tight, this doorway here, not sure that it flows the way I want it to, so could we change that? And that decision, could you change that, it has a significant cost element. So whatever changes you make as a homeowner after you get into the project has a cost implication. So it's critical that any decision that you make is, you sit down with your contractor and says, what is the cost implication of that? Because unless you're giving up something else to get that, inevitably that's going to come back somewhere down the road as a cost overrun that you got to pay. I mean, I don't know if you see, there's so much of these fixer-upper shows on television now, and you would see how good they are around costings. And the minute they're doing renovations and they hit one snag, they don't move forward until the borrower understands that this is going to cost, and it could be sometimes $1,500 more or $2,000 more, but they make sure that they get agreement as to where that money is coming from, and they get agreement if there's no more budget, then we're going to have to cut something else. And that's how projects are properly managed.
There's a show, I love HGTV, and there's a show on HGTV which I absolutely dislike, and that show is called Love It or List It. Do you know why? Because of Hillary Farr, the host. She's the one doing the is it Love It? So she's the one doing the repairs in the house. And I've always found that she's cold when she's breaking that bad news, because invariably, every single episode, Hillary's going to tell you, I'm sorry, that extra room you wanted, it's not going to happen because of X, Y, and Z.
You can't have it. Yes.
Which brings us to our next option for the typical step on that ladder, and that's the renovation, buying a fixer-upper. I've said this before. For me, Rob, my investment appetite does not extend to renovation, although we have friends who've done it successfully. And Thomas Leos, on previous podcasts, he would have given you some clues on what to look for to mitigate the risk. But how do you feel about clients coming, to purchase the first home, a fixer-upper in St. Lucia in the Caribbean?
Oh, I think a fixer-upper, construction carries risk every which way. The thing about a new home compared to a fixer-upper is that your expenditure could be more predictable as long as you stay with the plan. As long as you stay with the original plan, your outlay is a bit more predictable. Although you could have snags that you can't see. For example, in the Barbados market, one of the critical things is some areas have exposure to underground caves. So getting a geological survey is a very important part, because you could hit a cave that could literally blow your budget, because then you got to fill that up with something to give you a stable base to build on. And likewise, you have some areas in St. Lucia where retaining walls are necessary, and you get exposed to underground drainage that's coming through that you need to redirect. So there are issues even for new construction that you could have, but your expenses tend to be a bit more predictable. In the case of a fixer-upper, once you start pulling things down, it can look quite different. The key here, however, is to stick to your budget. Is to stick to your budget, and you have a proper, thorough inspection. You can't just get carried away from seeing what the potential is going to be. As thorough an engineering review or report that you can have, where somebody literally walks through and look at this house and sort of give you a view that, one, you either need to do everything before you move in, or you could do X amount and have the remainder done thereafter. So a thorough inspection is required, but a fixer-upper can be a great deal, and you could be exposed to to one, a low outlay because you can get a good deal. In essence, because you're not building from scratch, some of the construction risk are mitigated. I mean, when I acquired my home, which happens to be the only home, I bought a few pieces of land around the Caribbean, including St. Lucia that I haven't built on. But I acquired my home, and what I did was I took really good advice. I mean, I had a friend when we were buying. I was scared of this cost in the first case, and I had a friend who was a construction manager, and had him come in and do a full walkthrough and do an assessment of the house, look for any cracks. And he, first thing he said to me, look, he said, this house is structurally sound. You can move in and you can do nothing. If you're okay with the aesthetics, you could do nothing for a few years and it's all good. But you do these areas, you can do as much as you want and as little as you want. So you set your budget, figure out what that budget can cover, and stick to it. So we did that. We agreed to the cost, and we made a pitch. We got the deal, and then we said, okay, this is what we can spend. This is our budget, and we went through and we went and as a hard line as to what that would give us in terms of renovation, and we were satisfied that it got us to a point that we were very comfortable. But it took some heavy management because the person who was managing the project on our behalf had thoughts in her head that were way more expansive than what we wanted to do. So she kept trying to push us into areas. But as a banker, I've seen this so many times that I said, absolutely not. We are going to stick to this schedule, and we fought it all the way, but stayed on budget because we didn't change what our plan was. I mean, we hit a couple of snags, but we put in a little bit of a contingency to cover that up front, and that's critical with renos. I mean, on a construction project, straight up, they advise you to put in, somewhere around 10 to 15% on new construction. But if you're doing a fixer-upper, 25% contingency. So it means that comes out of the budget. If you have $175,000 to spend, you need $20 or so thousand dollars or $25,000. That's not budgeted as part of the fixer-upper. It's set aside as contingency. If it comes down to the end when you've close to finishing your work, that money is not used, then you have as an option to throw something else into the mix because you've set that aside. And that's what most people don't do with fixer-uppers. They go clean to the budget and expect that everything is going to go okay. So by the time they go in and they pull up the drains and see the plumbing is bad, there's no money left. So that piece that you put aside is even more critical for a fixer-upper.
Yeah, because of your banking experience, you do not have to listen to the contractor telling you, Rob, you won't be getting that extra room that you asked for. You didn't have to hear that.
Well, I knew from the get-go that how far I was willing to go, because and again, it wasn't just the contractor; it was also my wife. And, my wife at my house, having debates about whether we could do that and we could do this, and I said, no, that wooden flooring upstairs, gone. We're not doing that.
Gone. I think
Yes.
I think it's important for us to touch on our retention, because you spoke about having the contingency, as you said, and it's true. It's difficult to remove emotion from your bill and from the budget, and only after a while, or you must be a certain type of person, certain type of personality for you to resist doing the extras when you feel like, because as you said, when you walk through, it's a different feeling altogether.
Oh, it is. It is a different feeling, and you really have to go through that costing. And contingency is very different. Retention is very different from contingency. Retention is set aside for performance of the contractor, so it doesn't give you money that you can access. It's money that's there in case, in the end, contract something has not been done adequately by the contractor. There is some money set aside for that to be dealt with as a contingency in case something that's not done. But that's retention. But what I'm talking about is you having a bit of budget that you set aside personally in case something goes wrong or in case you have to make some changes. And that's even more important in a fixer-upper than it is in a in a construction, and it just means that money is not part of your budget. It's really and truly set aside, and you can negotiate that with your banker and say, look, because most fixer uppers that you're buying, you get two valuations. You get a valuation on purchase, but you also get a valuation of what the property will be valued on completion, and valuers do an adequate assessment, so you can get a good sense. So the bank gets a good sense in the same way that you will get for a new build what the value of the house will be on completion. You get a value for what your renovation project will be on retention, and generally there is more equity in a reno than there is in a new construction, because once you bring it back to value, it escalates. You get quite a bit more out of it. So you could afford to negotiate with your bank to set aside that $20,000 or $25,000 for that unknown that you may come across that you need to deal with. That when you pull apart, you realize that something in the substructure needs a bit of amendment, and you have a bit there to dip into in case of that.
Yeah, I didn't mean to conflate the two I guess issues. For clarity for our audience, contingency is extra money that you have in the budget to just in case you need
Yes.
snags, as you said, or anything else you want to add on. If you almost come to the project, as budgeted, then you have that little
Yeah.
luxury. The retention topic I guess I wanted to bring up was just to explain to our viewers, which you did, the benefit of the retention, because quite often it's painful when you see 10% of your project, of your budget, your loan amount is untouched until 3 months up to 6 months after the project, and of course
Yeah.
at the end of the project is when everybody is typically broke. So you touched on it, but if you want, you can add a little more, because definitely it is something that is for our own benefit, and it serves the purpose.
Yes, it is. It is for the benefit of the homeowner, the project owner, in that the contractor sets this amount aside from. Granted that you're paying the money out, but that money is being paid out and set aside for any corrections that need to be done before the property is handed over to you. Because you remember, I'm not sure how much. I know the St. Lucia market is moving in that direction, where you have certificates of occupancy or certificates of compliance coming into place, and most of our markets in the Caribbean are now moving to that standard, where before it's in place for commercial buildings, but in several islands now it's coming into play for residential property as well. In that before you can go in, your town and country planning or some department of your environmental health comes in and do a review of your home and issues you with a certificate based on whether the construction meets the required standards. And St. Lucia, if not there yet, is going to get there. It's already in place in quite a few of the islands across the Caribbean. And when although they would have viewed the plans before and approved plans by town planning, when the actual walkthrough happens, they could see things that are environmentally risky that you need to make some adjustments to in terms of how they're built. And if you don't have that, you can't occupy the building when you get that kind of discipline in place. So but even so, even without the legislation, when you go through and you need to have snagging done, it's important to see that there is budget that's set aside for things that just may not have, it requires some adjustment by the contractor.
As the homeowner or investor, that new legislation is going to be, very, very important and and will change the landscape, certainly in the windwards for sure. Because
It certainly will change the
when that
landscape.
happens now, when it happens now, Rob, what I'm thinking of now is liability. So my contractor has finished his job, and there's the retention. The retention period is still there, but we see something was not done, for example, in the kitchen with the plumbing, and we are refused the occupancy certificate. What recourse in those markets with the legislation in place? What recourse does the homeowner have to claw back that expense if the contractor is in breach?
Well, in those markets, yes. See, in those markets now, when you have your construction contract, a lot of construction in the windwards and parts of the OECS is done still based on loose contracts, and then a person does an estimate, you sign off on the estimate, and off you go without having a formal agreement in place. I would certainly strongly encourage some agreement, even in the simplest form, drawn up where it provides some contingencies. And in markets where you have that legislation in place, a requirement to meet to meet the standards to obtain your certificate of occupancy is drawn into your contract. So the contractor has a responsibility to ensure that the construction project can meet that, and then there's usually agreement on funds set aside in case something needs to be snagged in that event. But I've seen circumstances where, in the Cayman Islands, I've seen circumstances where borrowers have had some issues, and mainly around environmental safety, and then around plumbing and sewage. Those are the two areas where there generally is some concern, and I've seen situations where borrowers have had to spend a good amount of money to get those things corrected and having to wait a long period of time. And what's happening there, when you have those kinds of delays in place, it means, one, you're either staying in your rented property longer, you're staying by your parents longer if that's where you are, but ultimately your mortgage is now almost fully drawn, so you're paying interest at least on a very high mortgage balance, which you haven't yet been able to convert, because now your bank can't convert that building loan to a mortgage until you get the appropriate approvals in place. So you're sitting around and just paying interest to your bank and not really being able to start reducing your principal, all of which covers significant risks. So even in this market where those things are not yet in place, I would strongly encourage to have some sort of not just the estimate, but an agreement drawn up between the borrower, the homeowner, and the contractor to define the terms of the arrangement.
I definitely see that as an opportunity for Bank of St. Lucia to maybe partner with Ministry of Planning and Infrastructure when that program comes along. As the biggest holder of residential mortgages, certainly it would be in your interest to ensure that your customers have that knowledge. Now, talking about the other islands, and for our viewers and listeners outside of St. Lucia, please make the inquiry to find out if that home occupancy, I guess, certification is in place. But this segues nicely into our almost final question, which is about second homes, because if you're doing multifamily and you're doing subdivision, you will require a stamp certificate of completion by the DCA before you can get block and parcel and title for those units. So on the commercial side or on the multifamily side, it is already in place. And I can assure you, it's painful if you don't comply. I had to tear down a 72 feet deck because I was 2 feet too close to the neighbor.
To the boundary line.
It's 10 feet to the boundary, 10 feet from the boundary. But I think it would allow 8 feet, and I think I was probably 6 feet. So I had to bring in that deck, bring it back before I can get my certificate of completion from this year, and before I can get title to sell or to move it on. So you said that you were the second mortgage man. This is the holy grail for a lot of us. We have our home, and we're thinking of an investment property. Most of us do it after. But we're hoping that with the benefit of this podcast and other financial education programs, people can plan before they do their first building. So, Mr. Phillips, what's your view on multifamily and somebody starting off the property ladder? Why should they go for two instead of one?
I mean, I very much support it under circumstances where your budget is reasonable to to afford it. I mean, you see lots of homeowners now are moving into a case where not just they have multifamily, but they have a main unit and a small unit, and that's been it's come to the islands quite a lot more. It's become a whole lot more prevalent because of Airbnb and the attractiveness of marketing to that market segment. But even from a domestic rental segment, there is a viable market there to go after that banks would finance. The key is that the test performed by a bank in that circumstance is going to be a little bit more stringent, because we want to make sure that in the event your property, that you're not just relying purely on rental income. So if the property is not rented for a couple of months, that you can't afford to meet your payments, and then it puts the whole project at some measure of risk. So the test will be a little bit sterner on purely investment. It may be a little bit less stringent where it's a multifamily home where you are owning that. But if it's purely investment, you would see generally a shorter period, because if you're investing for a couple of things, if you're investing in property and you expect to turn that over, then you will have a type of financing almost as a developer, a small case developer, where you're looking to sell that property in due course. If you're looking at a rental market, then the bank will test whether, one, you can support a portion of that debt from your personal income, whether you can. I mean, and normally what we would encourage is for a person to have at least 6 months payments, set aside from the get go as part of the project, to sort of tide you through in the event that property is not rented for a period, or to build up to that, where you begin right at the get go, setting aside a portion of your rental income to create this little bit of a sinking fund, to service you in periods where you can't meet your payments. But it's certainly a market that we are just as interested in. I mean, it's about making sure that you do your work in the same way, that you look at, well, one, if you're building a property for rental, who's your target market? Are you building close to a developed area, where you're looking at a person who is looking to rent there for a period, because there's a lot of employment. Like, for example, apartments around the north for quite a period was very attractive, because lots of people were moving there for work and looking for 1 and 2 bedroom units for rental. So that market was quite attractive, and then of course supported very well by Airbnb. So you need to do your work. There's no point building something in an extremely remote area, just because you feel that it's great for me to build a second unit. Or who is your market? How many people actually live there? Unless there's some special appeal in that area where it's remote, but it is just that it's attractive because it's remote. So you got to know exactly what you're offering and who you're offering it to, and satisfy yourself in the beginning that there's good sense in that you've done a little bit of work, you've spoken to people involved in real estate to get a good feel for what your rental potential would be. And generally what you'll find is that, in addition to your personal income, a bank would not want to see you go probably more than about 50 to 60% of your rental income as a mortgage payment, because it needs to give you some surplus that you can take care of and set aside some money in case you have a challenge with rental for a period, as we are experiencing now in this market. But in the right area, it's certainly an attractive investment. I mean, and look, I think the way we interact with a home is still quite different in the Caribbean compared to North America, or in the Northern Caribbean. Because I lived in the Cayman Islands for quite a long period of time, and then traveled to the Cayman Islands and places like the BVI and Turks and Caicos, and the relationship with a house is very different from the relationship with a house in the Windwards. We still
For sure.
buy a house, and we have this strong emotional connection to it, and don't see it as an investment that at the right time we can turn into money when it's necessary. Whereas in the Cayman Islands, you'll go up, and when I went there the first time, I was just shocked. Everywhere I went, the whole island is for sale. Almost every house that you see has a for sale sign on it. And I said, what's going on here? Are people leaving? They said, no, they're not leaving. It's just in case somebody comes along and they want to offer the right price for it, they will turn it over, because their goal is on reducing their debt over a period of time by any means. And as far as they're concerned, they can build. This is a nice house, but they can build a nicer one. So you build and that's a good advantage of doing a fixer-upper or building a starter-type home, because if your relationship with it is different, it means that you could think about putting that up for sale if the market becomes attractive, and then getting some surplus for that and building another house that allows you to lower your debt over time. So I think we have to become a little less emotional about property, and think more about property, even the ones that we build for our own use, as an investment.
Wow, we could go on and on, because I still have so many more questions, but of course we can do that in subsequent shows. But my final question to you,
Sure, we can.
in observance of International Women's Day, which is March 8th. So, but broader, I guess, in observance of International Women's Month, what are some of your bankers' tips for women interested in property investing?
Well, I would say that women are already heavily involved in property investment. In that the workforce now is dominated, heavily. Some industries are certainly like financial services are dominated by women who have already been in the process of buying their own homes and buying homes that they turn into investment property. As a matter of fact, a lot of the decisions around converting what would have been garages into studio apartments, or seeing how the women are very aware of what's happening in the social media front and what's happening on how people are generating money out of property, and are in fact the ones who are driving and influencing the partnerships to move in that direction. And they are the ones who are managing these in a lot of cases managing the income generating side of the property, from rental of an apartment or something of the sort. So women are already heavily involved in property investing, and as a matter of fact, will potentially, with the way we are seeing, the level of women who are leading the tertiary education and people joining the workforce. I think you will see more and more women taking dominant positions as they already have in this space. So I think they're very much involved, very savvy, and the thing is that a lot is that while men tend to be the bigger risk takers, I think women take very calculated decisions around how far their budget can go and what they can invest in, and they tend to ask very shrewd questions. As a matter of fact, in a
Very.
lot of cases, contractors are very scared of wives, because while they can get away with things when the wife comes on a project, they don't miss a thing. They don't miss a thing, and they want to see value for money, and they question the amount of effort compared to work done, and they look very closely at budgets, because in a lot of cases, the women are the ones who've been managing the household budget for many years, and they're aware of all the other things that the family or an individual has to take into account, that they're not prepared to compromise on. They still want to make sure they can do all the things that make their life comfortable, and they will manage that project shrewdly to accomplish that.
I mean, Rolf, I could not have said it better myself. I want to give some feedback to our listeners and viewers. The women who've written to the podcast, left messages, they have two main issues. The first one is there's a general fear and apprehension of going on a property investment on their own. So we ask them to get
Mhm.
partners, whether it's family members, or if they have a romantic partner, if you are married, certainly from a company, and go through it that route. The other situation we have, up to Saturday, I got a call. One of our listeners was saying, Anselm, I want to do this, but my husband, I want to do it, but he doesn't want to. He's thinking, I've been talking for so long. And what I said to her is one, ask him to watch the podcast, watch it together, or the first book that a lot of us would
Yeah.
have read, which is Rich Dad Poor Dad. She told me on Sunday she's going to play the audio version for him to listen to. Our last guest told us that he says, make the numbers do the talking. Show your partner what the numbers are and make that do the talking. Sorry, go ahead, Amron.
Yeah, encourage your partner to go with you to see your bank. Don't sit down and talk about it yourself. Go see your bank and sit down and have a discussion about what you're trying to accomplish. And equally so, see a professional and talk through what you're trying to accomplish. You can talk to not just a contractor, but you can also talk to a realtor about what's going on in the area that you're interested in. So the biggest thing is to seek information. When you have information, it takes the fear out of what you're doing, and then you sit down and consult with your bank, and make sure that your risk is reasonable, and that you're aware of the areas where you're taking risks that are controllable, and allow some contingency for the areas where the risk will always be unknown. You can't button it down 100%, but you set aside something in the budget for that. And look, And generally, once you do that, you're in a good place. It doesn't need to be as fearful as you look, as long as you've done your research properly and you have the discipline around staying with what you planned in the beginning. And if you're going to make any alterations, you have to understand straight away that that's going to have an implication, and make sure you fully understand what that is, and that you have budget set aside for it, and that you make sure that you get value for the money that you spend. When you have staged payments, as these contracts would have, even for renovation. I mean, as I said, you schedule how you outlay your monies, and you stick to that. And if something is missing and is not done, then don't move forward. Don't move forward to the next stage until you can figure out what that is and get it settled. Is that risk that somebody says, "Oh yeah, but I will put that in order"? No, well, if it's not a big deal, put it in order first, because you're carrying that forward, without fully understanding what the implications. So it's just about having the discipline of dealing with those issues and getting good advice in the beginning, and it takes a lot of that fear away.
So I think in conclusion, we want to advise our listeners and viewers. First place you go is your existing bank, preferably Bank of St. Lucia, and you have the conversation with them, as to what your plans are. And I like the idea that there's this ongoing consultation process, and they grow with you as you grow. For me, it's also important for you to understand your budget, understand your earnings, understand what you want to do, understand the sacrifices that you probably invariably have to make. And finally, you said it yet again, stick to the budget. Resist in as much as it's possible. It might not be possible all the time, but try to stick with the budget. So we've just been speaking to the Managing Director of Bank of St. Lucia, Mr. Rolf K. Phillips, our new strategic partner. We look forward to more conversations on financial literacy. We urge all of our listeners and viewers to check him out on LinkedIn, check out Bank of St. Lucia, and stay tuned for our next episode as we continue our International Women's Day series.
Congratulations and thank you for tuning in to the Caribbean's first property investing podcast. We want to help Caribbean people create wealth and achieve financial freedom through property investing. Our show provides general advice based on personal experiences and is for educational purposes only. For more information, resources, and past episodes, visit us at CaribbeanPropertyInvesting.com. Remember to click the subscribe button so you never miss a show. Let's go.
I love my community. It teaches you the importance of being together even through difficult times. Business owners doing their best to make it through. Fishermen and farmers working hard to put food on our tables. Nurses caring for the sick shows me who we are made of. People who care. I guess it's about growing together.